Hello everyone, and welcome to our video on tips and tricks for effective ethics bowl judging. As you know, the NHSEB's purpose is fostering productive dialogue. And in this video, we're going to be giving you some suggestions for how to help us foster productive dialogue, both directly when you're engaging with the students in judges' questions, and indirectly based on what you're rewarding in your scoring. Let's start with the judges' questions. So the first thing we want you to remember here is to keep it short. There are 3 judges, and each judge gets a question and a follow-up. So if each judge uses a minute each for their question and for their follow-up, that's 6 of the 10 minutes that are used up, and that leaves no more than 4 to hear from the students, which of course is the point of judges' questions. So this is why we recommend that you try to keep your questions to no longer than 30 seconds each. If your question requires a lot of setup or explanation, this means it's probably a good idea to think of a new question. Short and focused questions also tend to get you better answers. The longer, more complicated your question is, the more likely it is that the team in their response will latch on an element that you were less interested in hearing about. Now, the second thing that we would like you to remember in judges' questions is to stay neutral. Whether we like it or not, we judges are in a position of power over the teams, and the students are hyper aware of the fact that 1/3 of their total points for a round depend on what the judges think about the answers they give to judges' questions. So this means that if you as a judge let the team know what your position on the case is, there's a real risk that things will degenerate from productive dialogue in which the team feels comfortable saying what they really think about the case to the students telling you what they think you want to hear. What does this mean in practice? You might, instead of asking a question like, it seems like your position is wrong because of X, what do you have to say in response to that? You could ask a question like, so what would you say in response to someone who says that your position seems wrong because of X? In general, the idea is to de-identify yourself from the content of the question that you're asking. So in summary, when it comes to judges' questions, I'd like you to remember 2 things: keep it short and stay neutral. Now let's turn to the scoring. So the first thing we'd like you to remember in scoring is to stay consistent. So it's generally good practice to have a default score for teams that do well, and then you can give more points to teams that do very well and fewer to teams that do poorly. When I judge, I default to about 80% on all of the scoring criteria and go up and down from there. Some people have slightly lower by a point or 2 default. Doesn't really matter as long as you apply it consistently. It's also entirely appropriate to score comparatively. So if, say, you give team A 4 out of 5 on the metric of responding to alternative points of view, and team B you think did significantly better on this, consider giving them a 5. Again, what matters is that you're holding both teams to the same standard. The second thing that we would like you to keep in mind when it comes to scoring is what not to evaluate. We judges are all people, and that means that we consciously or unconsciously react to all sorts of things about teams, the presentation style, that are not the things that we're trying to evaluate. Some of these are obvious and apply well outside the NHSEB. For instance, the identity of the students on the teams, things like race, gender, religion, obvious disability, ethnicity, and related phenomena like the fact that some accents are more prestigious than others. Now I'm going to turn to a couple of my colleagues with the NHSEB to talk about some other things that are more particular to our competition that we would ask you to not judge based on, and do so in an intentional way.
Great, thanks, Carl. So the first thing that I am going to talk about is this idea of judging based on whether you agree with the position that a team takes. So our policy is that you should not judge along those lines. Instead, what you should be looking for is the clarity and cogency with which a team defends its position, the way that it responds to criticisms of its position, and instead of trying to guide a team to believe whatever it is that you believe, you should be looking at the sort of process of their thought as they develop their position throughout the round. I know, of course, that it can be a challenge to sort of separate yourself from your own view of the matter, but to the extent you can, you should attempt to be neutral about the issue for the purposes of judging, and award points based on how well the team defends the position that it takes, regardless of what that position actually is. So now I'm going to pass things over to Audra.
Yeah, so this is of course true in person, but it's especially true right now. You should not be judging teams based on their physical presentation. So if they have uniforms, or they're well dressed, or their backgrounds are uniform, none of these things should be entering into your scoring at all.
Great. So next I want to talk about something that I like to think of as the aesthetics of a presentation. So these are features of a presentation that don't really contribute to the clarity or cogency of the presentation, but that are done to give a kind of veneer of clarity and cogency. So these are things like handing things off to a teammate to discuss some new part of a presentation, or adjusting the tone of one's voice to try to make it sound more persuasive, or using language that tries to paint opposing perspectives as bad or mistaken without providing good reasons to believe that they're bad or mistaken, things like that. These are the kinds of tactics that are used in politics as well. So one sort of thing that happens quite a bit in politics, and less often but still occasionally in the ethics bowl, is stating a view with a tone of incredulity that anyone could ever believe it. So there's a reason that politicians use these kinds of tactics, and that's that they work. So you should be especially sensitive to whether you are being drawn into what I'm thinking here of as the aesthetics of a presentation, rather than to the substance of the presentation, which is all you should focus on.
Yeah, so one of the less obvious aesthetic features of a presentation that doesn't really have anything to do with the substance of the presentation is the number of members of the team who speak. That should not play any role in the score that the team receives, whether one person speaks for the entirety of the round or whether every member of the team talks. It doesn't matter.
All right, and the final thing that I'd like to discuss is the use of moral theory in the course of giving a presentation. So for any non-philosophers listening to this video or watching this video, you may not even be familiar with the idea of moral theory, but the idea is that a number of philosophers for a long time have given theories about what makes certain kinds of actions right and wrong. And participants in the ethics bowl are often schooled in these theories, or at least the very basics of these theories. And they'll sometimes mention them and use them in the course of giving their presentation. So you might hear something like, we're going to adopt a utilitarian perspective on this. And then they'll go on to describe their position in those terms. The use of theory can be a bit of a distraction, I think, for judges, particularly judges who are not philosophers. So the most important thing to keep in mind is that the teams are not allowed to presuppose that either the other team or you, the judge, know what they're talking about when they mention a theory. And any theory is going to emphasize certain moral concepts above others. So some moral theories might focus on the consequences of our actions. Some might focus on certain kinds of rights that people have. Some might focus on things like autonomy or happiness. These are the kinds of, these are important moral concepts that these theories invoke, but the key is that it is the burden of the student to explain their position using these concepts and not merely relying on a theory as a kind of stand-in for thinking about these issues through these concepts. So if you find a team that's either name dropping theories or name dropping particular philosophers, you should be aware that it is on them to explain in more depth what they mean and what the important moral concepts are that they're invoking in defending their position about the case. And if they merely rely on dropping names of theories or philosophers, then that's just not sufficient for the purposes of judging. So don't be distracted by theory and insist that the teams get to the real substance, the real substantive moral concepts at work in their presentation.
Okay, and the final thing I want to say is that you should refrain from giving any verbal feedback during or at the end of the matches. We really want the students to focus on what's coming up rather than what has happened. And but we would really encourage you to give written feedback on the score sheet because that can be really helpful for the teams.
Thank you, Ian and Audra, for giving us some advice about sort of common pitfalls to avoid, and be very deliberate about not judging based on. So in summary, regarding scoring, we want you to keep in mind two things. Stay consistent and remember what not to evaluate. And this concludes our video on tips and tricks for effective ethics bowl judging. If you would like to find out more information, we have a video on developing good judges questions and a video on going through the score sheet and looking at all of the criteria and how to evaluate based on them. And we direct you to those. Thank you for watching.